Welcome back, everybody. Today, we're going to take a deep dive into a fascinating topic, people pleasing, but with a specific focus on how it shows up in people with autism. Our main source for this deep dive is a really interesting article from Cheap ABA called Understanding Autism and People Pleasing Behaviors. And I'm super curious to explore this with you because, we can all kind of recognize people pleasing behavior when we see it on the surface. But I have a feeling there's a lot more going on, especially when we think about the unique experiences that autistic individuals have.
Oh, absolutely. It's a complex issue for sure. And the connection to autism definitely adds like a whole other layer.
Okay, so let's jump right in. The article lays out a bunch of reasons why people with autism might be more prone to people-pleasing behaviors, and one that really caught my eye was the difficulty with social cues. Could we start there? Can you kind of paint a picture for me of what that experience might be like and how it might lead someone to feel like they need to constantly please the people around them?
Okay, so imagine you're trying to navigate a social situation, right?
Yeah.
And everyone else seems to just get it.
Mm.
Like they understand this unspoken set of rules, a language of cues and expressions, but you just can't quite grasp it,
Yeah.
that feeling of being out of sync,
Yeah.
of not knowing how you're supposed to act. It can be so anxiety-provoking.
So it's kind of like walking into a party where everyone's speaking a foreign language that you only kind of sort of understand. You're catching bits and pieces, but you're missing like the nuances and the real meaning behind everything.
Exactly. And in that kind of situation, I mean, it's totally natural to want to avoid making a mistake, right? To not stand out or offend anyone. So one way to deal with that is to just try to please everyone. If you agree with everything and go along with whatever people want, maybe you can avoid those awkward moments or any potential conflicts.
It's almost like a defense mechanism then, right? A way of trying to keep some control in a world that feels really unpredictable and overwhelming.
Yeah, precisely. And for someone on the autism spectrum who may already be super sensitive to sensory input or like emotional overload, that need for control can be even stronger.
That makes a lot of sense. The article also mentions that difficulty with certain types of social cues can be especially tough. Can you give us some examples of those?
Yeah, sure. One common challenge is like interpreting facial expressions. Think about how much we rely on those subtle changes in someone's face. A raised eyebrow, a tiny frown, all that stuff to understand their emotions and what they're thinking. But for some autistic individuals, figuring out those little signals can be like trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. You know,
So someone might like misread a neutral expression as anger or disapproval, and then they end up overcompensating by trying to please the other person to smooth things over.
that's a great example, yeah. Another challenge is understanding things like sarcasm or humor. Those rely so much on tone of voice and context, which can be really hard for some autistic individuals to process. Yes.
I can see how constantly misinterpreting sarcasm could make someone feel like they're always saying or doing the wrong thing, even when they have totally good intentions.
Oh, absolutely. And that constant fear of messing up, it can fuel this like intense desire to please others as a way to avoid those perceived social blunders.
It's like they're walking on eggshells all the time, always trying to anticipate what others want or expect from them.
Exactly. And, the more they try to please, the more they might actually lose sight of their own needs and wants. It can become like a vicious cycle.
This is really starting to paint a clear picture for me of how this all plays out. But before we jump into like the negative consequences, I'm interested in another reason the article mentions, the overemphasis on relationships. Can you talk a little bit about what that means in this context?
Sure. For lots of individuals with autism, forming and keeping relationships can be especially challenging, right? Social interactions can feel really confusing, even draining at times. But the desire for connection is still very real.
So if relationships are already difficult, it makes sense that someone might go to great lengths to preserve the ones they do have, even if it means, sacrificing their own needs in the process.
Yeah, exactly. For some people, pleasing others becomes like the main way to maintain those connections. It's a way of showing love and loyalty, proving their worth as a friend or family member.
And I could see how that could lead to some really unhealthy dynamics, right? Especially if the other person isn't aware of what's going on.
Absolutely. And that's actually something we'll dig into more as we continue our deep dive and explore the impact of people-pleasing. But before we move on, I do want to touch on one more reason the article mentions: low self-esteem.
Yeah, that's a big one. I can imagine past experiences with social rejection or just being misunderstood could really take a toll on someone's sense of self-worth.
Yeah, unfortunately, you're right. And when someone is already struggling with low self-esteem, that desire to please others can become almost compulsive.
It's like they're always seeking validation from outside sources. because they don't feel worthy or lovable on their own.
Exactly. And that external validation, that feeling of being needed or appreciated, it can become almost addictive. It's a temporary fix,
Mm.
but it ultimately keeps them trapped in that cycle of people pleasing.
This is all so interesting. I bet our listeners are already starting to see how these different factors all weave together to create this really complex issue.
Yeah, I agree. And honestly, we've only just scratched the surface here. There's so much more to explore as we delve into the impact of people pleasing. And, most importantly, how we can support autistic individuals who are struggling with this dynamic. It's important to remember, though, as we talk about all of this, that wanting to please others isn't a bad thing in itself. Actually, a lot of times it comes from a place of being kind and caring,
Mm.
which are really important in any relationship, right?
Yeah, that's a good point. It's not like we're saying people pleasing is always bad. It's more about recognizing those times when it becomes a problem.
Exactly. It's all about finding that balance. And unfortunately, when it gets to be too much, like excessive or compulsive, it can really have some serious consequences.
So let's get into those. What are some of the negative impacts the article talks about?
Well, imagine this. You're constantly saying yes to every request, putting everyone else's needs ahead of your own, never setting any boundaries. That kind of constant self-sacrifice can lead to, you know, burnout and just feeling super stressed all the time.
Just thinking about that makes me feel exhausted. It's like running a marathon that never ends.
Yeah, it can be so draining,
Hmm.
both physically and emotionally. And the worst part is, the people they're working so hard to please might not even realize all the sacrifices they're making. And that can lead to resentment building up over time. And that can be really damaging to relationships.
Resentment is tough for sure. I can see how that could really hurt relationships, even if the intention was to make them stronger.
Oh, absolutely. And it's not just resentment either. When someone's always focused on pleasing everyone else, they can start to lose touch with their own values, what they like, even who they are as a person.
That's kind of what I was thinking about earlier. When you mentioned that overemphasis on relationships, if your whole identity is about pleasing others, what happens to your own sense of being an individual?
That's a really good observation. It's like they're living someone else's life, not their own. They might wind up in jobs they hate, relationships that don't make them happy, doing things they're not interested in, all because they're afraid to disappoint someone or cause any trouble.
That sounds like a recipe for being unhappy. And the article also talks about having trouble setting boundaries as a big consequence. Can you explain that a bit more?
Sure. Setting boundaries is super important for healthy relationships. It's about being able to say what you need and what your limits are, respectfully, of course, and being able to say no when you need to. But for someone who's stuck in those people-pleasing patterns, saying no can feel almost impossible.
It's like that word just disappears from their vocabulary. Every request feels like an obligation they can't get out of.
Exactly. And without boundaries, they're open to being taken advantage of, manipulated, or just overwhelmed by what everyone else wants from them.
This is all starting to feel a little heavy. It makes me want to just curl up and hide from the world.
Haha, I get it. But the good news is there's hope. The article doesn't just point out the problems. It also gives some really practical and helpful strategies for supporting autistic individuals struggling with all of this.
Oh, that's good to hear. So let's shift gears and dive into those strategies. What are some of the key things to take away?
Okay, so first of all, we need to move away from this idea of fixing people-pleasing and instead focus on empowering people to understand and accept their own needs and wants.
I like that. It's not about wiping out that desire to please others altogether. It's about finding a healthier way to express it.
Exactly. And one of the best ways to do that is through self-reflection. Encourage them to explore how they're feeling, what they like and dislike, what their values are. All of that helps them build a stronger sense of self.
So things like journaling, doing something creative, or just having open and honest conversations about what makes them happy and what drains their energy, those could all be helpful.
Absolutely. It's all about giving them the space to connect with their inner world, to rediscover who they are outside of the roles they play for others. And once they have that stronger sense of self, they can start to build the skills they need to set boundaries and speak up for what they need.
Which brings us to the next strategy, teaching assertiveness skills. Can you give us some examples of what that might look like?
Sure. One technique that works really well is role-playing. You can set up different social scenarios and practice saying no in different ways, expressing your needs, standing up for yourself, but doing it respectfully and firmly.
It's like giving them a toolkit of communication skills they can use in those tricky social situations.
Exactly. And it's not just about words either. Body language matters too. helping them understand how to project confidence and assertiveness through their posture, their eye contact, how they use their voice. All of that can make a huge difference.
It's like a full body approach to communication. I like that. What other strategies does the article recommend?
Another important piece is validating their emotions. A lot of times people with autism feel like their feelings are wrong or that they need to hide them to please others, but just acknowledging and accepting their emotions, letting them know it's okay to feel what they feel, that can be really powerful.
It's about creating that sense of safety and acceptance so they don't feel like they have to hide who they really are to be loved and accepted.
Exactly. And that ties into the importance of us modeling healthy boundaries in our own lives. We need to show them what it looks like to take care of ourselves, to say no sometimes, to have limits in relationships, even with people we love.
We have to walk the walk, not just talk the talk.
I love that. Our actions definitely speak louder than words, especially to those who are watching us closely and learning from what we do.
So we've talked about self-reflection, assertiveness, validating emotions, and modeling boundaries. What else is there?
The article also talks about encouraging people to make their own decisions. Every time someone with autism makes a choice, big or small, it strengthens their sense of independence and control.
So it's about giving them opportunities to make choices, even if those choices might not be the ones we would make for them.
Exactly. And it's about respecting those choices, even if we disagree. It's about trusting them to learn and grow from their own experiences.
I can see how that would be tough, especially for parents or caregivers. They're used to making decisions for their loved ones. But in the end, it's about helping them become independent and able to take care of themselves.
Absolutely. And speaking of support systems, the article also points out how valuable professional guidance can be, from therapists or ABA specialists who really understand autism and how people-pleasing works.
That makes sense. They can provide support that goes beyond what friends and family can offer.
Exactly. They can help people develop coping skills for anxiety, navigate tough social situations, and build their self-esteem. They can also work with families to create an environment that's more supportive and understanding.
Are there any specific strategies or techniques that therapists use to address people-pleasing in people with autism?
There are quite a few, actually. But one that I find particularly helpful is cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT for short.
Yeah.
This approach helps people identify and challenge those negative thought patterns, the ones that contribute to people-pleasing.
So, like, if someone's always worried about disappointing others, a therapist might help them look at the evidence for that belief and help them come up with more realistic and balanced thoughts.
That's a great example. CBT also focuses on teaching coping skills for managing anxiety and becoming more assertive. It's very practical and action-oriented.
I can see how that could be really empowering for someone who feels trapped in that cycle of people-pleasing.
It really can be transformative. And it's important to remember that therapy is a two-way street. It's about finding a therapist who's a good fit, someone who understands the person's unique needs and goals.
We've covered a lot of ground here, from understanding why people-pleasing happens in autism to practical ways to support people. Is there anything else from the article you think we should highlight before we wrap up? As we've been talking about all this, one thing that keeps coming back to me is this idea of creating a safe space, like a safe space for people to just be themselves. It seems so important, especially for people with autism who might have felt like they had to hide their true selves to fit in or please others.
Oh, absolutely. That's a really, really important point. Creating that safe space means making an environment where people feel accepted and valued, celebrated for who they are, not who they think they should be.
So how do we actually do that? What does that look like in real life?
Well, I think it starts with listening, really listening without judgment. It's about letting go of our own expectations and trying to see the world through their eyes. It's about celebrating their interests and passions, even if those things seem unusual or different to us.
I love that. It's about shifting our focus away from fixing or changing them and just appreciating and honoring who they are.
Exactly. And it's about giving them chances to express themselves in their own way, whether that's through art, music, writing, anything, or even just having honest conversations where they can be themselves.
So if someone loves trains, for instance, instead of trying to push them towards things that are more, quote unquote, age appropriate or whatever, we make space for them to explore that passion, to share what they know, and connect with other people who love trains too.
Exactly. It's about validating those passions, not putting them down, and helping them find their people, the ones who will get them and appreciate how awesome they are.
As you're saying this, I'm realizing that This idea of a safe space for authentic self-expression. It isn't just for people with autism, it's something we all need.
I completely agree. We all want to belong, to be accepted for who we are, to avoid conflict.
That's so true.
And sometimes those needs, they can lead us down a path of sacrificing ourselves, which just ends up making us feel empty and unhappy.
This deep dive has been so eye-opening for me. I feel like I have a much better understanding of people-pleasing now, especially how it relates to autism. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us today.
It's been my pleasure. This is a topic I care a lot about, and I hope our conversation has been helpful for our listeners.
I'm sure it has been. And to our listeners, I want to leave you with this. As we've been talking about people-pleasing and people with autism, I think we've also touched on some things that are true for everyone. We all need to belong, to be accepted, to avoid conflict. And sometimes those needs can make us sacrifice ourselves in ways that leave us feeling drained and unfulfilled.
That's a great point. It's a good reminder to check in with ourselves, to ask ourselves those tough questions. Am I living a life that reflects my values? Am I taking care of my own needs? Am I setting healthy boundaries in my relationships?
Because at the end of the day, our well-being depends on being able to be ourselves, to embrace what makes us unique, and to build relationships that support us as we grow and change.
Beautifully said. And if there's one thing I hope our listeners take away from this, it's that they're not alone in this. Whether they're on the autism spectrum or not, if they're struggling with people-pleasing, there's help out there. There are strategies that can make a difference. And there are people who understand and care.
That's a really hopeful message. Thank you for reminding us of that. And to our listeners, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into understanding autism and people-pleasing. We hope you've learned something valuable and feel empowered to create a more authentic and fulfilling life for yourselves and for the people you love.